Lynn, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm so excited because today is my first day recording without Jeff.
That's
Thanks for being
awesome.
here with me.
Thank you for having me. This is so exciting.
I've really been looking forward to this. So, why don't you tell us a little about you and where you are in your writing journey and what we're going to work on today?
All right. So my name is Lynn. I write under a pen name, Elizabeth Lynn Seaton. And I say that as if I've actually published. I've not published anything under that name yet. And I'm working really hard. I finally said, let's stop talking about it and let's actually do it. So
Good for
I'm like,
you.
darn it, 2021 is going to be my year to start doing things. And this opportunity came up and I was like, oh, having an editor look at something that I've written and help give me pointers and things to that I can improve. Yes, please.
Well, excellent. I'm so glad that you're here. Can you tell us a little about the piece we're going to work on today?
The piece that we're working on today is a piece that I wrote. It started out as part of my world building. I was working on my first novel, and I'm like, I need to get a better handle on how we got to a point in it. And so this is like the how we got to part of it. And it kind of morphed as I wrote it, and like, ooh, this would be an excellent like ending to one of the books in the series. It
Mhm.
magically became a series.
I mean, as all good stories should.
Right? I'm like, this is too much to have in just one book. Of course, it's a series. I
Yeah.
mean, let's not be silly. So this was like the culmination to one character's um, arc and their rescue, and sets up some of what they do afterwards because this is somewhat early in the series.
Excellent. Excellent. So what we're going to do today is, so typically when Jeff edits, he'll have edits already on the screen and he'll walk through the edits. And that is really great because it helps him connect with writers where they are.
Mhm.
But Jeff is a writer, so he knows what writers think when they write. I am a reader who just happened to get pulled into editing. So I probably think about the way the story reads a little bit differently than Jeff does as a writer. So what I was hoping to do today is I made a couple of highlights in the document just to remind me of what I was thinking when I was reading it and hearing it. But
Uh-huh.
what I wanted to do with you today is kind of go through cold, if you will, through the document to walk you through what it was that I was thinking as a reader, to maybe help you as a writer think about the reader in the writing process or in the editing process. Because at the same time, like, an editor is not supposed to disrupt the writing process, right? Like, there's something really great about that raw first rough draft that just gets the story on the page. Editors can come in and move things and change things and say, oh, you need this and you need, like, we can do that all day long. But what we can't do is we can't get the gut story on the page. So as I was reading your story, I was really excited because you have so much good action and great characters in here. What we want to do is find ways of elevating their voices so the
Yes.
reader connects with your characters the way that you as the writer are really connecting with that character, because I could see your passion for what was happening in the story, but as the reader, like, I could see it, but I couldn't feel it yet. So we're going to
Yeah.
turn a couple of things around so we can turn up that dial on the emotional intensity for the reader. But we'll do it in a way where I'm kind of walking you through my thought process to hopefully help you and anyone who decides they want to listen to us, hopefully help them find the things in their story that they can elevate as well.
Awesome.
Okay, great. Any questions before we get started?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay,
Let's
then
go.
let's go ahead and get started. I won't torture you anymore and keep talking about it. We'll just actually open it up. All right. So here we are in the story. And let's see. I'm not sure what Zoom actually records. So I think it's recording the screen that
It
I'm
should, yeah.
showing. Okay, so you're seeing your story up on the screen now, right?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, so I was a little lazy in my read this week, and I had you may have, if you've listened to Jeff's podcast before, anytime I talk about reading, I always talk about myself as a lazy reader. And I read the parts of the story that I want to read, right? Like, but I was running particularly late in my edit on this because I had a big project over the weekend. So I didn't get to do my reading when I thought I was going to get to do my reading. So I was driving home from the office today, and I was like, I really want to read this story because I had started it, but I hadn't gotten into it. So I was like, you know what? Let me just pull my car over here into a safe location. So I pulled over and I opened up the story in Word on my iPad and made it, I used the read aloud feature. So I was driving home and my iPad gave me a little story here. I got to hear your story as though it was an audiobook, which I actually really loved because it really helped me stay into the story in a way that I wouldn't have as a reader, because I tend to jump. You've probably heard me say this. I just jump to the dialogue. I skip over prose. I just jump to dialogue. But I was so glad that I listened to it because there's so much good stuff going on in this first part of the story.
Oh, thank you.
So what I want to be able to do with you is I want to tell you kind of where I found really great places for us to just turn things around a little bit. So we start off and the goddess is waking up and she's in a massive amount of pain. Now, I did have the opportunity to read the first page before my wonderful technology read it to me. So let me show you what I read as a lazy reader.
Okay.
I read, the goddess woke to cramps and a shivering cold. Even the air hurt. The agony was indescribable. The thought made her laugh. Send the empire into madness. On the other hand, no option was guaranteed before he broke her. So now I have to say, I am extremely on the side of if it's not like lighting up and glittery, I'm not going to read it. Most people are probably going to read more than that. But my eye goes to the shortest parts of the story. And part of that is because I'm trained to look at that because I'm looking for the dialogue. So when I see those short sentences, that's where I'm going because I think they're dialogue. But here's what I found when the iPad was reading it to me. There's a lot going on in here, right? So the aftershocks, right? Like that's important. This oily goo creature. Oh my goodness, I missed this oily goo creature. What is this? I need to know more about this, right? Then I see some blood and this idea that she's stretching and she's trying to feel what she can feel to kind of like push her boundaries, right? And then we get into this place where she has no reserves, no powers, no contact with her disciples. Oh my goodness, there are other people in the story. They're really important too. She wants them. And my immediate thought here was, why aren't they with her? Why isn't she talking to them? And then I thought, okay, so as a reader, I'm reading this and I'm like, there are opportunities for her to maybe talk to somebody, but there's nobody there for her to talk to. And then I'm like, we can almost always put somebody into the story. And then I was like, no, I got to trust the author because the author knows when this character needs to be alone and when they need to be with somebody else, right? And then we get into a whole lot of backstory in here about the word and passing the word to somebody else for protection. And I'm like, This is important to the story. As a lazy reader, if I'm not catching that, I'm going to get 6 chapters down the road and there's going to be something about the word. And I'm going to be like, wait a minute. What is this word? And I'm going to have to go back page after page after page and find the word. Okay.
Sure.
So again, what I'm having here as a reader is a push and pull.
Mm-hmm.
The story is really exciting. There's something really powerful happening here. A huge event just happened, but I want to get to the place where I know what's happening, but I'm missing all these other things. So then I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit. And then we get into this place where there's a tendril from the glistening black pool reach up. I'm like, I'm all in for that, right? Like, I want to know what's happening with that tendril. Why is it there? And why wasn't it with her this whole time, right? Like, and then we have this one word, lady, right? And now I'm like, yes, now there's dialogue. And then there's not dialogue. And then there's dialogue. So here's what I, as an editor, would suggest for this piece. Making the first line some sort of dialogue.
Okay.
So what happens if I'm just going to track changes here. Now, okay, I gotta time out here. I know you're really excited to hear the editing. I gotta take a time out here for a second. I'm so sorry.
Fine.
So as an editor, my job, depending on where you are in your editing cycle, where you are here, this is kind of an early draft. You're still thinking about kind of how it flows with the rest of the story. You're still trying to maybe get your characters out. You're still maybe thinking plot.
Yes.
As an editor, if I come in and I do line edits and I'm like, this needs to be this, this needs to be this, this needs to be this, I might not be supporting your vision of what you're trying to do with this piece. That kind of line editing works really, really well when somebody knows where the story is going. It's kind of like second, third draft type editing. So in this case, rather than making all of the changes, I would do something like this in an edit, and I would say, if I could type, I would say,
it's the theme of the day.
I've
I've struggled with that all day today.
Or maybe you're finally awake, or welcome back. Something to show that there's somebody else there. Now,
sure.
This could go a couple of different ways. As I was reading the first part of it, when I got to the place where there is a disciple and she's got all this pain and she's trying to see if she can move and if she can, my first instinct as a reader is, where are her friends? Why isn't somebody sitting next to her whispering, don't move, stay still, you're hurt, right? Like that was my first instinct. But then I got to this paragraph where she says she has no contact with her disciples. And I'm like, oh, well, that's a little bit harder because there's a big separation here. But we've got this black goo. We've got all this pain. So something happened. And then when we get a little bit further and we hear that this character here is, I have to make you scream, there's an immediate enemy. Well, I'm telling you, if I'm torturing somebody, I'm not torturing people, but if I were, and somebody passes out on me, I'm waiting there for them to wake up so I can continue the torture, right? Like, or I'm putting somebody next to them to alert me when they're awake so I can come back, right? So by adding this other character in here, we automatically have the opportunity for the goddess to talk to someone or at least express externally the pain that she's feeling. So instead of us describing this massive ache that ran over her entire body, we can give her a sigh, a sound, a stretch. the pain escaped her lips.
Okay.
Now
Yeah.
we're immediately in the moment,
Mhm.
right? Nobody's
Mhm.
telling us she's in pain. We're hearing the pain come out of her, right? Now, the other thing that you did that was really great in this story with this goo monster is that the goo monster is trapped by the master, right? The
Yep.
goo monster wants to escape. The goo monster knows that the goddess has all this power. So if we go back up here and instead of welcome back, the goo monster says, shh, stay still. And then she says, where is he? Now we immediately see that there's some camaraderie there. And then you take this line here, where he told me that I had to make you scream.
Mhm.
We pull it up here. Now there's this moment of, I'm trying to help. There's somebody else that we're both fighting. He told me I had to make you scream. Almost all your words just put in a different order, right?
Yeah.
Then
Oh.
you can get into this moment where you can explain what just happened. Okay. So now there's no contact with my disciples, right? Now, this is something that you as the writer need to decide. Was she always away from the disciples? Has he been torturing and hurting the disciples? Like, but as she's clearly a leader because she's thinking about these people all the time. So her first thought after, I have to care about the safety of what's happening here, is most likely going to be about them, right? So and obviously you as the writer would take my edits here and go, she's not going to call them my disciples. She's going to call them, you used a different word down here for them. It started with an H.
Oh. Her honorai.
Yes, honorai. Yep. Thank you. So you would come back and you would make that change, right?
Yep.
Now, you'll notice that as I'm writing these questions that she's saying, I'm not saying, where are my disciples? I have to make sure they're safe because she's in pain in that moment. She can't form these thoughts. We might even decide that we add, this is where those dialogue tags, it's okay to put them anywhere in the sentence, right? Like, I'm very passionate about my dialogue tags.
I love dialogue tags. Yep.
Right? Maybe she tries to stand up. Maybe she tries to gather her strength. But whatever it is, we're showing that they are so important to her that they're very second. But now we don't have to say the aftershocks and the sensations because we're there in the moment. It doesn't matter that there's blood flecked and there's goo flecked. We can add that in. She whimpered as she wiped the blood off of her face, right? Like, but what we've done here now is we've taken all of this great story and we've flipped it around on its head. So I'm there in the moment with them.
I'm so glad I'm not taking notes because I'd like start rewriting it as we're talking. I'm like, for people who are listening, I'm sitting here nodding like I'm a little bobble-headed doll going, oh yeah, that's awesome. Yes, yes, please,
Well, good.
more.
Good. I'm glad you're connecting with that, because sometimes as writers, like, we have a vision in our head of what our story should look like. And an editor comes in and is like, well, here's what I want to do. I want to move this piece, and I want to move this piece, and I want to move this piece. And we go, but wait, how does that affect my story? And what a good editor writer relationship is it's my job to give you ideas as the writer. It's your job as the writer to take them and fold them into your vision or throw them away, right? Like, it's not my job to come in and rewrite your piece. Now, if you wanted that kind of edit, well, then that's a kind of edit that a writer and an editor can have together. But at this stage, typically it feels better to the partnership for me to make some of these suggestions and then go through and find places. So like when we get in here with the word, right? Like, this is all really important stuff. I'm just going to put in the margin, change to dialogue, right?
Yep.
Now we know. So like, now the goo monster has to respond to where the disciples are. What's the next important thing? The word, right? Maybe the goo monster says, if you help me, I can help you protect the word, right? Because the goo monster clearly knows that there's a word, right? Like, that's what it's there to drag out. But if you bring that up in the conversation, it's much more exciting for me as the reader to be like, wait a minute, the word, what do you mean the word? What am I supposed to do with this? I'm supposed to protect it. I'm supposed to say it. I'm supposed to share it. And then we talk about how we can share it. We can give it to somebody else, and then we don't have it. I'm like, okay, so, and then the goo monster is going to help her try to give it to somebody else, right? So like, if the goo monster brings it up and says to her, I can help you, but you have to help me, right? Like, this all the same thing is happening as you're telling us, but we're in the room, we're watching it happen, as opposed to having a narrator tell us, okay, so this is what happened before. Okay, so that's one way we can go with this. The other direction that you can go with this is allyship, right? Like, the goddess has an ally now. Now, it's a forced allyship because the goo monster wants out. Maybe it does not like that the master has kept it captive and is using it to do all of these horrible things, because it has wonderful, masterful plans of its own, right? Like, lots of things can be happening here. If you want that first scene to be more adversarial, instead of starting it when she wakes up, take the last 10 minutes of the torture scene, and he's in the room saying, you will tell me the word, or I will kill your disciples. You'll never get it out of me. You'll break. I won't. I'm too strong. I will plunge you into madness. You are not the first I've plunged into madness. Obviously, you give them a better voice than Laura's voice there, but right, like, you can do that with the story, and then end the scene and open it back up when they wake up where there's this allyship. So it really depends on where this is happening in the story. You were mentioning that this could be the end of one book that leads into this desire for the next book. If this is an ending, you want a huge emotional climactic storyline at the end. My recommendation at that point would be, show us the fight with the master. Show us her holding out as long as she possibly can. Show us the master putting the pressure on the goo monster to do the evil things. Show us the resistance there, so that when the monster is helping her when she wakes up, we understand the allyship. If this is the beginning, this is the prologue, that's like the start of her journey, it doesn't matter that there was this huge torture scene because you started with the pain, right? Like that's where we want to start. We want to, she's in a hole and she's coming out of the hole, right? So we're going to build her up out of there. It doesn't matter which way you tell your story when we're looking at the edits. Where it matters is where it goes in your story arc. What is it, early? Is it late? Is it the climax? Is it just a plot point? You know, thinking about all of these things can help you make some decisions. But either way, and part of this is because we're the dialogue doctor editor, but part of this is because as readers, we emotionally connect to characters when we feel what they're feeling and we see what they're seeing, as opposed to being told what they're seeing. So I'm almost always, when I get a script like this as an editor, I'm almost always scrolling through until I see the first line of dialogue. And I'm going to figure out how I can move that first line of dialogue to the first thing I see. Because if I'm in Barnes and Noble and I pick up a book off the shelf, I'm going to flip to the middle of the book, just pick a random page, and I'm going to flip pages until I find dialogue, because that's how I'm connecting to the character. I don't connect to stories through prose. There are other readers out there who do. I'm right, like the dialogue doctor is just one way of seeing it. Okay, so that's my like opening. Here's how I would kind of turn the story around. What questions do you have? What can I answer about that?
I don't have any questions, because like these suggestions, as I'm watching you type it, I'm like, oh no, I would state it this way.
Yes.
But I see where she's going, and I can apply that in so many places. Like my brain's already turning through all of my open things, going, ooh, ooh.
Excellent, excellent. And that's what this type of editing is supposed to do. This type of editing is supposed to take a writer who knows their story and be able to connect them to the reader just a little bit differently. Mm-hmm. So there are a couple other places where there are things that as an editor, I'd say, okay, let's take a look at. And because we talked about opening, I want to talk about ending a scene. Okay.
Okay.
So this is 30,000 plus, or no, 3,200. I can't
commas,
do numbers, right? It's 3,215 words. All right. Yep. Now that's with my edits in there. So it was probably 3,200 words. And so this word count thing, I'm going to let you in on a little secret here. This word count thing has, until I started actually editing with people other than Jeff, the word count actually meant nothing to me. Jeff would be like, oh, it's 500 words or it's 5,000 words. I'm like, you could tell me it's 5 million words and it wouldn't mean, like, I have no idea how that translates. So I'm starting to learn the process of where it is. So when we're thinking about our scene length, right? Like there's this kind of, in my mind, an arbitrary cutoff where people say like 2,000 words a chapter. I don't know what writer or what editor created that rule, but it seems to be like a writer's rule. And I mean, I read a lot of books and I like where they end their chapters. So I guess it works. But like as a reader, I don't care how many words you have. I just want to be there for the story. So when I'm reading, I'm looking at where we're pausing and where we're picking back up and where I want an end to a scene. So let me roll down here to one of my little notes over here. Okay. After the goo monster helps the goddess, there's this moment where she's reaching out to her friends, and we'll talk their details a little bit later. And then there's this moment where she has to break her promise and everything's going bad, right? Stop right there. For a moment, time stopped. That is the perfect place to break your chapter.
Okay.
You as the writer know where the story is going. So
Mhm.
you want to continue the story, right? Like you just want to keep going, keep going, keep going. This happens a lot. Jeff talks about this a lot when you have a really emotionally intense scene with two characters. And as the writer, you're so connected to that emotion that you want to wind that emotion down so that you feel safe and you can go do the next part of whatever your day is and feel like this is all really resolved, right?
Mhm.
As a reader, I don't want that resolution. I want to break here because I want to know that I can turn the page. Okay. So binge watching Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime, they're all amazing because back before there were streaming services, we had to wait an entire week before another episode came out, right? Right. And then, like, for those of us who are old enough to remember like VCRs and even before VCRs, when we actually had to sit in front of our television at 8 o'clock, right?
And adjust the antenna. Uh-huh.
Yes, yes. And when there was a commercial break, you had to go really fast to do whatever you had to do because you didn't want to miss, right? Like, okay,
Anything. Uh-huh.
those of us old enough to remember that know that the reason why it works so well to stream from one episode into the next is because they leave us with that cliffhanger. They leave us with that moment of like, oh crap, what's going to happen next? So when you get to this place where there's this turmoil and there's this fighting and there's this huge thing, and for a moment time stopped, you end the chapter there, I can almost guarantee you, unless something crazy is happening in my house, I'm turning the page and I want to know what happens next. Okay. So as an editor, one of my jobs is to say, end here, pick up here, break this storyline apart. Often, if we're telling a story from multiple points of view, we have a tendency to tell one person's story like all the way through, and then the next person's story all the way through. Sometimes if we can break both of those stories in half and kind of make them one and then the other and then the other, it's going to keep us reading. George R.R. Martin, not a huge fan of his work, but he's great at this, right? Like, he knows when to end a chapter, and then he doesn't show you that character for like 15 more chapters. So you can, I did read one of his books, just like flipping through to find the one storyline I wanted to read.
Sure. Yep.
Because there were too many characters. I couldn't follow it. But it's that same idea. So as an editor, I'm looking at when do we want to end because we want to leave on a cliffhanger, and when do we want to end because we've wrapped the story up too much. But this was one of those places where, as I was kind of thinking about how I would go about editing this, I would want to stop here because I would want to physically turn the page to go, yeah, I'm ready to see what happens next. Or I go, it's 4 o'clock and I have to be up in 2 hours for a meeting in 3. I'm going to wait till after work, right? Like, it's going to be the thing that gets me through the day so I can come back and pick up, right? So that's what I would recommend there.
Okay.
Questions about ending a chapter?
No, that's awesome. That's something that I've struggled with because you're right. As a writer, I keep writing and I just keep, throwing it up on the page because I need to get it out into first draft. And then I come back and go, okay, what's the end of the scene? What's the end of the chapter?
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. Happens all the time. And it's great, right? Because as a writer, you're doing the hard part. As an editor, I'm just like, oh, page break. That's it. That's all I have to do. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about emotional modulation now, because this is another thing. And for those of you who are listening who have attended the conference, we typically talk about modulation after we talk about core character voice, because character voices should modulate, which means like we all have a voice. It sounds a little bit different when we're desperate than it does when we're happy than it does when we're sad, right? Like all of these different emotions make words come out of our mouth differently. So similarly to the way that up here, when we were taking the goddess's language and we were breaking it up with different cadence and we were moving the tags around, this is a modulation of her voice, but we just went directly to pain with it. So I want to talk about modulation before I talk about character voice for these characters. And the reason that I want to do it is, again, getting back to that moment of showing the reader what's happening by letting them be there, as opposed to telling them what's happening. And we have this tendency when we're writing, and it doesn't matter what we're writing. If we're writing an email, if we're writing a novel, if we're writing a journal article, if we're writing a press release, if we're writing a newsletter, it doesn't matter what we're writing. We use a writer's voice, right? Because people, when they type differently than they speak. So thinking about how we say things when we're in the moment is really one of the key things that we do with editing. And this is a really great example, because you've got a lot of dialogue here already that we can just take and expand out and pull out a little bit more. And in the margin, you saw that I wrote desperation. I wrote desperation because she's waking up from this like huge, we don't know what's going to happen. And there are all these people around her. And again, I probably moved some things around so there wasn't as much prose before there was dialogue, but that's okay, right? Like the dialogue's there. And we think about what she says. Here she says, save the black oil, wait, save it. But if she's in this moment of desperation, she just betrayed the person who, or the thing that was helping her. And it hurt her so much to betray them. And now she's like, I have to save them. You do this amazing thing where you're talking about, like, she doesn't really know why she's doing it, but that makes the desperation even more apparent. So let's think about what it is that she's going to say. The fact that she's articulating the black oil feels a little bit too cognizant. If she can say that, then she probably knows what's happening. Maybe she starts, and there are tons of different ways you can go here. Maybe she starts with just a stop, or don't touch it. Maybe it's save it, save it. Right? Or, you know, and I would not do all of these. I would choose like the one that feels most intense in this moment, right? They're trying to help her. So maybe the stop makes the most sense. Or maybe it's just don't, right? Because then we think that she's waking up and she's fighting with the master or the goo monster first, right? And then it's like, it's okay, the quiet, calm voice next to her. So I'm going to change that, and I'm going to go, I'm going to do the don't.
Okay.
Please stop. Desperation, I'd throw some body language in there amongst it, just to, you know, kind of break it up so it's not such a pleading. And then you have another character say, shh, it's okay. You can learn to type at some point in your life. You're safe now. And then she says, don't touch me, right? Don't touch me. Because it's not about me, it's the oil, right? She has to save it. Hush now, or maybe just rest. I don't know, whatever people say when they're calming you. And then it's, you don't understand. I have to help it. Because now we're in the moment with her. We're feeling the desperation, we're feeling the struggle, we're feeling the quiet. And in here, I'd say something in here about like the quiet voices in the dim room, whatever it is, something to show that she's struggling against this calm, right? Like, because now as the reader, I'm all in. I'm
Mhm.
leaning forward in my seat. I'm holding the book really close. I'm holding my breath to see what's happening. Why finally she gets it out, and maybe they say, what? And she says, the oil, or the goo, or the, maybe she says its name. Maybe at some point in the scene before, when they're having a moment of connection, she says, what's your name? And it says, I'm whatever, it's
Bob.
right.
It's
And
my
then
default.
she says it there back. And then they start to understand her desperation. And somebody says, everyone stop. Everyone stop. Right.
Yeah.
And then they say, how can we help? How do we save this? And she says, we have to collect it. And then you create one voice in the crowd that starts giving directions. You get the blanket, you get this, you get that. And she collects it, and everybody else steps back, and she gently puts it all into the bucket. It's the same story you were telling me here,
Mhm.
except that now I can't stop because I feel what she feels. I feel the desperation of don't touch, don't touch. But wait. Okay, now there's a resolution here, right? Like we all come together all at the same time. That work for you?
Yeah. Yeah. That's, yeah. As you're talking, and I'm like, that's what I was, that's where I want that scene to be. That's where I want it to go. I just, like, after I did the dump on the page, I'm like, oh, where
Right.
do I start to
How do you?
rearrange these things?
Absolutely. So let's talk about how you would do this in a different scene. Okay. So for those of you who are listening, if anyone is listening, I don't want to assume, I mean, we're recording this so people will listen, but that doesn't mean anybody will listen. So if you're listening and you're in the Slack channel, this is the kind of thing that that in the editing prompts that go out on Thursday, that I'm trying to help writers be able to identify for themselves. So last week and the week before, I had you all, as you were reading, put the emotions in the margins, because that's what I do when I'm reading, right? Like I'm here and I can tell as a writer, you're trying to show desperation. Save the oil, wait, save it. That felt desperate to me. So if I put desperation in the margin, when I go back and I look at the modulation of this voice, what happens when we're desperate? We don't speak in complete sentences. We say the same thing over and over again. There's tons of miscommunication, but we are insistent that people listen to us, right? Once we can articulate how the emotion happens, we can take the lines that are there and manipulate them to show what it is that we're trying to see. Now, sometimes it takes a couple of passes to get that back and forth between the characters right, so that it really feels like desperation is building and then dropping, right? Like the desperation in the beginning has to come from this idea of fear. We think that she thinks that somebody's hurting her, but then it's about protection, and then it's about speaking up for someone else, right? Like, and this is how we watch the modulation of the emotion change. Now, as a new writer, you might have in your margin desperation here, and then maybe down here we get to comment relief, right? And you're modulating from desperation to relief. Well, as you do this more and more often, you realize that most of the time, to modulate from desperation to relief, there has to be a peak in the desperation before there can be this downward into the relief. So sometimes we might want to change desperation here to panic, or fear, panic, desperation, understanding or realization, and then relief. So we're seeing kind of that arc build and go down. Other writers don't need those markings in the middle, because they just are naturally and emotionally in-tune person who knows that there's an arc. Doesn't matter what kind of writer you are, figuring out how to use the tools in the way that works best for you is going to make the most sense. There are lots of things that you can do for this. Sometimes in the editing prompts, I suggest putting like lines in your paragraphs to show kind of where you're switching from one modulation to the other. Sometimes I just suggest counting the number of exchanges. Like if you go from desperation to relief in 3 exchanges, you probably missed something, right? Like there might be another emotion there. Now, if you go from fear to panic in 3 exchanges, that's probably pretty realistic, right? Like we could escalate fear to panic pretty quickly. So just kind of thinking about those things as we're editing our piece can really be helpful.
Okay. Absolutely. Yep.
Great. So now I want to talk a little bit about voice, if that's okay. All right, so back up here when we first see the language between the goddess and the goo monster, it felt to me that as a writer, you were trying to create the goddess as a strong character who's kind of trapped by someone who is either more powerful than she is or used some kind of ruse or deception to trap her, maybe doesn't quite have the same power. Okay. And you've got this creature that maybe doesn't have the same type of intelligence as your main character and the master. And you are trying to show that through the language that the character is sharing, right? Yes. Maybe a little bit more robotic, maybe a little bit more formal, almost as though English isn't its first language,
yes,
right? Like it's programmed to understand. So yes. That's kind of what you were going for.
Yes.
Great. So what I would recommend that you do is take that and push it to the extremes. So the goddess who is used to being in control and powerful, not at the very beginning, because in the very beginning, she's hurt, she's in pain. So that's going to be a modulation. But in here, once she finds an ally, her language is going to start becoming more, it's going to have more bravado to it, right? And you can let the goo monster kind of parallel that with its formality, but you want it to still have an equal pacing. Okay, so pacing is an element of dialogue that confuses a lot of people because the dialogue doctor uses pacing differently than when we think about pacing. Typically, when we think about the word pacing, we're thinking about how quickly or how slowly something is happening, which actually, ironically, falls underneath of cadence, because cadence is the ebb and the flow of the dialogue. Pacing is more about your running partner than it has to do with your own speed, right?
Okay.
So for anyone who is a runner, I am not a runner. I wanted to be a runner for like 6 minutes once. But then I actually tried it and realized that that's way too much work. Those people who can run are way, way more disciplined than I could ever be. So if you are a runner out there, you have my applause and my admiration, but I'm never going to run with you. So, but you pick a running partner who paces with you, right? You don't want a running partner that depending on how you're training, right? Like if you're constantly chasing them, then that's not an equal pacing. If you're constantly running and turning around and come on, right? Like that's not fun either. Dialogue works the same way. And that's why when we talk about pacing, we're talking about as it relates to the other person. So if we look here in the pacing of this scene, and again, I'm not looking at any of the words, I'm just looking at the the size of the paragraphs.
Mhm.
We've got a longish one, a short one, a long one,
Long one.
nothing, a short one, a long one, right? Like the pacing of this makes it hard for me as the reader, first of all, to remember who's talking, but second of all, to figure out like, where's the important part of this scene? So what
Mhm.
I can do is I can take this and I can break some of this up into different places so that different characters have different parts of the conversation. Now, here's one of the things that I do as an editor a lot, that can work really well if you're willing to think about your information
Mhm.
apart from your characters. So often what happens is, as a writer, we use dialogue to share a whole lot of information, which we're
Mhm.
doing here, right? Like there's backstory here. This is that connection between I can help you if you can help me, but we have to know why. Like I can set you free. You have the power. If I give you this, you can do this. There's this bottle and this stuff, right? Like a lot of information here. And as writers, you hear us at the Dialogue Doctor say, if you have a lot of backstory, if you have a lot of things to describe to your reader, put it in dialogue, right? Like we say that all of the time, but then we put it in dialogue and then we come back to you and we're like, but now it's just paragraphs of, right? Like, so how do we do it, right? So thinking about how information exchanges, right? There are a couple ways information can exchange. You have one person who has all the knowledge that's sharing it with the other person, like a teacher lecturing to a class. If that's happening, then your pacing is going to be a lot of paragraphs with maybe a couple of questions or a little bit of nods. That can work, but it's not super interesting for us as the reader, right?
Right.
You can turn that around and have the same character have all the information, but the other character really drive the pacing by asking a ton of questions. Just peppering you with questions, but then that's not really interesting because it's just question, answer, question, answer, question, answer, question, answer. It's basically the same thing as this person talking. The only difference is there's a balance in the pacing. So what we can do is we can break the information up and we can share it amongst two people. That works really well, especially in a situation like this where we have a collaboration. The goo monster has half the information. The goddess has half the information. The goddess is trying to put herself in the goo monster's place. The goo monster is trying to put herself, it or itself, whatever pronoun
Itself.
it chooses to use, with the, like the balance there, they can share the information. So let me stop talking about it and just show you what I mean.
Okay.
Okay, so there will only be one chance. He can't know that I helped you. If he suspects, then he will punish me, right? This is all one line from the goo monster, all very much in the goo monster's voice, but that's a lot of information all at once. But if we do this, so we've done it. Sorry, I couldn't type and talk there at the same time.
That's okay. I had to respond to a text message.
Oh, okay. So it worked out
Something's
well.
on fire. Yeah. It can wait now.
Okay, good. Okay, so we had this line, there will only be one chance. He can't know that I helped you. If he suspects, he'll punish me. And then the line was, then why chance it, right? If we take those four elements and we break them up so that the monster says, there will only be one chance, again, in the very formal language. The goddess is smart and powerful. She can assess the situation. If he catches us, you'll be punished, right? Like the goo monster doesn't have to say that. She can say that. Then we must ensure he never knows that you helped or that I helped you.
Mm-hmm.
And then she's compassionate and she cares about other people. So instead of saying, then why chance it? She says, you would risk that for me. And then the goo monster says, I doom myself to existing here and only here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Bam, that works. You've done exactly the same thing, but now it feels like a conversation where two people are connecting with one another over the same thing. They're both providing part of the story. It doesn't feel off balance. This is a good example of where balancing your pacing helps engage your readers. Okay.
Awesome.
All right. So there was one other place that I wanted to show you an opportunity to take something that's prose and make it dialogue. So you've got this really great part of the scene where she's reaching out to her honoree and she now has this power to connect outside. She can give the word to them, but we have to know that they're not there, right?
Yes.
You've told us that they're not there. She's reaching out. These are the easiest people for her to contact. You're telling us that. Okay. But I'm not really like feeling the connection or the desperation or why. So we can take that same thing and think about how is she reaching out to them? What would she say in her mind if she was trying to talk to them? Maybe she says, my loyal honoree, can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah.
Right? Same thing you were saying before. But you putting the words in her mouth, maybe there's this idea that they're too far away. There's only one left. She waits tearfully for the response. Has he killed you all? Right? You're telling us that he's tortured them. Was he lying? Or did you get away? Maybe one of them says, maybe one of them speaks back for just a moment. It's not safe. We're safe. We got away, whatever it is, just one little moment, but then it's gone, right? And then she can curse the distance. Or you have these other people, she calls out to the honoree and they don't answer. So she reaches out to the people. And instead of saying that they didn't realize it was a dream, she hears them roll over and whisper, it's okay, it's just a dream, right? Like she hears it, but she isn't, it's not her telling us or the narrator telling us. It's we're in that moment. We're feeling what she's feeling. Plus, the goo monster is still there. So maybe the goo monster is saying, has he killed you all? Goddess, they're too far away. She doesn't have to say it. They don't have to say it. You've created this brilliant scene where there's somebody else in the room. It's a little bit more difficult if there isn't a go monster and she's just alone in a cell all by herself, which is often why characters create, writers create Jiminy Crickets, right? Like, can you imagine how boring Pinocchio would be if Jiminy Cricket wasn't there? Not just because he had this great personality, but because Pinocchio had nobody to talk to.
Yep.
You know, Dumas in The Count of Monte Cristo. It's about a man who's in prison for his entire adult life. He's not in prison by himself. There's another prisoner for him to talk to, right? Like
Yep.
we have to create these elements. In a one of these that we did a couple weeks ago, we were talking about how oftentimes in spy movies, I think maybe it was Robert Ludlum that we were talking about, right? Like the most lone wolf person is never actually alone in the story because there's always somebody there for him to play
To
off on,
interact with.
because we need that connection. You did it because it worked for your story. Use that to work for your dialogue as well.
Okay.
So
I
all
want to write.
So what else can I show you? What else do you want to think about? Did you have a question? Was there a section that maybe you wanted feedback on that I didn't share with you?
All this as you're going through like each example, I'm like, oh yes. And so I'm already in my head like reorganizing things, and
Great.
and so there wasn't anything that stood out other than I have the scene, I love the scene. The dialogue can be better, absolutely can be better. So you've given me a lot to process, to go through. So yeah, was there anything else that you wanted to
I'm just
point
gonna
out?
go ahead and stop sharing for a second.
Okay.
And then talk about like, so we talk a lot about the editor-writer relationship and how it can work. Like we kind of started this with where your scene is and where, as a reader, I'm going to make suggestions about where we can pull this one thing forward or we can push this one thing. At this place, we're going from like first draft to second draft or second draft to third draft, thinking about the way the story wants to come out. How do we want the story to be told? There's another round of editing that can happen. So there are lots and lots and lots of amazing editors in the world. But sometimes they're a specific kind of editor and they only want to do that kind of editing, whether they're capable, whether they focus on it, whether it's the thing they like, whether they have enough work to keep them busy with that kind of editing, doesn't matter, right? Like they want to do one kind of editing. What I really think about as I'm working with a writer is, how do they want to work? Where are they in their draft? What kind of editor do they want? And who they want to edit at different stages. Some people like to work with one editor all the way through. They want the same editor to do their story, to do this kind of editing, to do the like final drafting of the editing, to make sure that the language is exactly right and everybody's voice stays in, and then somebody to do grammar and spelling. We at the Dialogue Doctor try to offer all of those different kinds of services. And we even do like the planning services where it's like, hey, you're about to write a book or you just wrote a draft. Let's talk about what your cast of characters looks like. But we also understand that people like to work with different editors. So where you are right now here is you're taking your first draft where you've got your story down, and now you're thinking about how to push the dialogue, how to create these voices, how to get them closer. At that place, when you have that next draft, if you're interested, we can come back alongside you and we can read these voices. And when we get this line of dialogue, we can go, okay, so your pacing is really great in this scene, but your voices sound really, really similar. Well, and in this case, they're almost all her. So that might work.
Yeah.
But like when we're up here and we're talking about these two different voices, if we hadn't written these two voices to be so distinct and so different, we would come back alongside you and go, okay, so this scene flows really well, but here's what I would suggest editing voice-wise. Or maybe you get really close, but there's a pacing issue or a flow issue. And we say, okay, so this works really well, but this part of your scene actually doesn't make sense down here. Let's move it up and put it to the top. It becomes more of a traditional edit. So we can, like, depending on where you are in your process, that's also something like, if you get to a place where you've rewritten this and you feel really good about it and you want to think about how do you do kind of that polishing of voices, hit us up, let us know, and we can do another round of edit that looks like this.
Awesome.
The other thing is, now that you've seen how to do this, if you like take a scene and you break it down and you're thinking, okay, well, here I think I want to do this, and here I think I want to do this, and I think I want to move this up here, and I want to make this dialogue, and you just want to let us say, hey, can you just make sure that this is kind of the best way to think this through? We can do that as well. So
Awesome.
all that to say, which is Jeff's favorite line, we can kind of do whatever kind of editing works for you as a writer, because again, I said this at the beginning and I love to repeat myself, so I'm going to say it again. The editor and editing in general, not just working with an editor, but editing your own work in general, should never get in the way of the creative process. It should just be a way to take the creative process and elevate it to get you where you want to be faster and more efficiently than if you were working on your own.
Awesome. And I love how you this conversation right here highlights that there really are lots of editors out there, and it is important as a writer to find an editor that you can work with. It's not just the editor working with the writer, it's also the writer working with the editor. So it's a relationship that you need to have, and you might have to search to find the one that works for you.
I love that, like the way you're thinking about that, because it's true, right? Like, as a writer, you're trusting an editor with your heart and your soul, right? Like, I have yet to meet a writer who's like, yeah, I just kind of threw this together and I don't really care about it, right? Like, just whatever, do whatever you want. Like, it's passion on the page.
They might say that,
but they don't actually mean it, right? So, but yeah, it's that, like, you wouldn't just let anybody come into your home and babysit your children. You shouldn't just let anybody edit your work. You should really kind of know and understand, their philosophy on editing and that sort of thing. So, I love that the way that you think about it from the writer's standpoint, finding the right fit for you, because that's what I think about as an editor. You gotta mesh with the writer. You have to feel the story that the writer feels. And part of my job as an editor, I said this a little bit as I was going through, is to put myself in your place as the writer, to say, okay, it seemed like in this place, Lynn was going for this with this character and this with this character. How do I take that vision and push it? Now, sometimes it's going to be, I see that you're doing this and I see that you're doing this. Have you thought about doing this instead? But if you say, as the writer, yeah, I thought about that and I didn't want to do it, then it's my job as the editor to go, okay, well, let's make your vision work. And sometimes people who are editors feel like, well, I gave you a note and you didn't take it. So, well, but that's not the point of the relationship. So.
And I like how during this conversation, there's a few times where you've said, well, I think you were going in this direction. And that was such valuable feedback, because either it tells me, yes, that actually came across, and then you gave me suggestions on how to make that stronger, which are awesome. I'm going to go right later tonight. But if that's not what I was trying to get across, then that's something that I'm missing and I can fix. I can change the wording or the pacing, or something to get it to go in the direction where I wanted it to go. Because as the writer, I'm already there. I don't need the words on the page to get me.
Yep, exactly. And I think what you feel there is very common for writers, is like, I know my story, I know my backstory, I know who my character is. I don't have to, for my own self, I don't have to share it. So for you as a writer to be really open to hearing how your story is coming across to a reader who's looking at it for the first time, I think that it takes a lot of humility and bravery and just willingness to, like, get the story the way in the way that people have the same passion about it as you have it about it. So I love that. I've had so much fun working with you today.
I've had a great time. I'm so happy that I did this, that the offer was open and I jumped on it. I'm so glad I did it.
I'm
Thank
so
you.
excited too. I'm gonna go ahead and turn the recording off because that's what Jeff always says at the end. So I have to keep with his